Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Secretary and Admiral, for those opening statements, and you won't be surprised to know that I have some follow-up questions about the PLAN task group. And so, Admiral, I might direct them to you in the first instance. You said in your opening statement that as of this morning, the task group is roughly 252 kilometres from Hobart. I assume that means they remain inside Australia's exclusive economic zone. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Do you have any update on your belief about their intended route?
Senator, of course, that's a question the Chinese can most authoritatively answer.
Yes.
We have been monitoring them and drawing assessments on what path they may take. At various times, the task group has avoided weather or conducted its own training, which has led to possibilities that it could have gone further east in the Tasman Sea, could have turned back north, as previous task groups have done. But the fact that they are currently south of Hobart and proceeding southwest suggests that it is more likely now that they may proceed through the Australian Bight.
Right. Andrew Green and Stephen Jedgetts from the ABC have reported this morning that quote-unquote military officials believe it's likely that the task group is being accompanied by a nuclear submarine. Does Defence have a view on whether that's likely or not?
I don't know whether there is a submarine with them. It is possible. Task groups occasionally do deploy with submarines, but not always. So I can't be definitive on whether that's the case.
Okay. I want to go back to the start of this expedition. When did Defence first become aware of the task group's formation to the northeast of Australia?
We have been monitoring the movement of the task group through its transit through Southeast Asia. And we have observed the task group as it has come south through that region. We are aware that the task group split into two components, one of which came down to the west of Papua and into Australia's northern waters. The other component of the task group proceeded to the east of Papua New Guinea before they came together in the Coral Sea to the southeast of Papua New Guinea. So we have had an awareness of their movement, and from the point of time where the first of the vessels entered into our more immediate region, we have been conducting active surveillance of their activities.
Can you be more specific when you say entered our immediate region and when that surveillance commenced?
So the frigate, which was the westerly of the two components of the task group before they came together, it entered the Arafura Sea on Monday the 10th of February.
Okay, and our surveillance commenced from our active surveillance commenced from that point?
Yes.
And continues today?
Yes, in cooperation with other partners. New Zealand has been public, but we have been working with a range of regional partners as part of that surveillance effort.
Has our active surveillance been continuous from when they first entered the Arafura Sea to now?
We have been maintaining awareness of them continuously, and certainly while the vessels have been closer to Australian waters, there has been an active either sea or air presence as part of it. The task group has moved, at a period of time, moved well out into the Tasman. New Zealand picked up a shadowing activity as part of that with a New Zealand frigate, and New Zealand P8 aircraft have also, between the cooperation between the two nations and using all the means available to us, we have actively monitored the movement of those vessels.
It sounds like from your answer, though, that our own active surveillance has not been continuous. There have been times which we've handed off to other partners like the New Zealanders, so there's been breaks in our surveillance along the way.
So if your question is, have we always had an Australian aircraft
Correct.
or ship? We have cooperated with New Zealand to share that based on the best disposition of military platforms at the time, and consistent with our planning of, depending on what the task group did, of making sure that we had assets best placed to cover off on different options depending on where they proceeded.
Okay. When was the Minister for Defence and Deputy Prime Minister first notified?
Of the movement of the task group into our waters?
Correct. I'll get more specific on the live firing exercise next, but just initially on the movement of the task group.
I'll just invite others to join me on those details, Senator.
Senator, Hugh Jeffrey, Deputy Secretary, Strategy, Policy, Industry. We provided advice to the government on or around the date of it entering into the RFURC, and I think it's around about the 11th of February, but we can get the date for you precisely.
Okay.
Bernard Phillip, First Assistant Secretary, International Policy. We provided formal advice to the Deputy Prime Minister's office on the 7th of February.
7th, okay. And how often have you been briefing the Deputy Prime Minister and Defence Minister or his office since then?
We provided daily updates.
Daily updates, thank you. When did Defence become aware that the task group was intending to travel southward along the Australian coast?
Senator, as I indicated, the task group disaggregated and then split into two components, with the westerly of those two components travelling east through the Torres Strait. They then came together to the southeast of Papua New Guinea. The task groups have done that previously, and some have proceeded out into the southwest Pacific. Some have proceeded back north. So we were evaluating as that task group came together and monitoring their activities. It would be a more conclusive definition as in the days that followed that as they started to proceed further south.
At what time did the PLA enter into waters they've never before done? You said they've come further south than they ever had before. On what date did they cross that threshold?
So I can be just clear on that answer. Of course, the PLA has had ships that have transited to the south of Australia previously. They've done that in 2019, so that they're not currently doing something that we have not seen in terms of Chinese vessel presence to the south of Australia or on the eastern coast of our country. What is different with this one is, in the past, vessels that have done it have either been returning from counter-piracy patrols conducted in the western side of the Indian Ocean and have come through this. What is more peculiar in terms of, or particular in the case of this task group, is it has come directly from the Southeast Asia into Australian waters. So the task group has now gone further south than we have seen PLA vessels before. In the last Talisman Sabre in 2023, we had a Chinese intelligence collection vessel that came well south in the proximity of Sydney. So we've seen Chinese vessels in our waters to the east and south of the country previously, but just not in the form that we're currently observing.
Have Chinese vessels ever entered Australia's exclusive economic zone on our east coast like this previously?
Possibly, Senator. I would think we'd have to go back, including particularly the intelligence collection vessel back in 2023. So we could relook at the path as we understood it. So it is possible that's the case.
I'd be grateful if you could provide that update today, if possible. Obviously, if questions are taken on notice today and an election is called soon, the Parliament will be prorogued and questions on notice effectively won't get answered in a timely way. So if it can be provided today, that would be appreciated. How many Australian Navy ships are involved in shadowing the task group?
So I would just be considered in the way I answer that question, because I don't wish to give away our disposition or our planning for how we will continue to respond. But I can happily indicate we've had two different vessels of our own that have changed in and out. We have additional vessels available to us depending on the movement of this task group in order to maintain that active surveillance pattern. The New Zealand frigate has been involved, as I'd mentioned, with aircraft from both two countries. But if I could answer your question in part by saying I'm very confident we have the capabilities to maintain that presence. We have strong availability of different platforms of a variety of natures to be able to achieve that effect.
Can you say what class the Australian ships were?
The two frigates that have so far done it have been Anzac-class frigates.
Thank you. Have we been using P8 aircraft or other RAF aircraft to monitor the task group?
Yes.
Which aircraft?
P8s.
Any others?
No.
Okay. Thank you. You've already spoken about coordination with our New Zealand friends. When did Defence first become aware of the task group's intention to conduct a live fire exercise?
So Defence became aware through, there were two reporting means. Perhaps if I could step through the circumstances with the first of the high sea firing events. There were two reporting paths. There has been public commentary on this one, clearly from a civil aircraft that heard the radio call that the Chinese vessels were making to provide indication of what they were intending to conduct. A New Zealand frigate operating in the vicinity of that task group as part of the shadowing activities also heard that radio call, so the communication pathway for that messaging went both through a civil air services and air traffic control approach, as well as it did through military reporting chains from the New Zealand frigate then into our Australian military system. Okay,
so you kind of answered my subsequent question, but still not clearly my first question, and I'll want to explore that in more detail, and I know Senator McKenzie will want to as well. So my question actually was when, not how. When did Defence first learn of the activity?
We were first notified of it by Air Services on the morning of the event.
Right. Senator McKenzie will correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Air Services has testified that they learnt from a Virgin pilot and that they were notified half an hour after the commencement of the live firing exercise. Does that mean Defence first learned of it only via Air Services Australia and Virgin half an hour after it commenced?
I think just to be clear, and I'm not entirely sure of the characterisation of what the Virgin aircraft heard, whether that was the firing window, so the part of the security call that I understand the Chinese vessels indicated a firing window. So that would be normal practice. I think for the event on that Friday morning, we understand the Chinese were advising a firing window from 9:30 till 3 p.m. I'm using Canberra time, if I may, Senator, for it. So the Virgin aircraft may have heard it inside the firing window, but that may not have been at the time that the vessels were conducting the firing.
Yes, but so as I understand it, Air Services Australia told Senator McKenzie on Monday night that the Virgin pilot reported to Air Services Australia at 9:58 a.m. The firing window, as you say, commenced at 9:30.
Yes.
So is it the case that Defence was only notified via Virgin and Air Services Australia 28 minutes after the firing window commenced?
Yes.
Right. So this is an important development because the Prime Minister and the Defence Minister and others have said that either that the notification from our Chinese friends was not adequate or not sufficient, but it actually seems, in fact, there was no notification at all prior to the commencement of the firing exercise.
So, to our knowledge, the notification was that call that had made from when the firing window opened, and that, in our view, is inadequate notification as well.
That's not inadequate, it's after it started.
Well, that's when the civil aircraft heard the call. We can't be definitive on whether there was a call made by the Chinese vessels earlier than that. So, as I'm sure, Senator, you appreciate, aircraft operate with the range of their radios depend on where the aircraft is and where the transmitter is. So there may have been earlier calls made from the vessels that the Virgin aircraft had not heard.
I understand that, but what's the value of a notification if it's not received, if it's not heard? The government's been very clear that the notification was not timely, that it should have been earlier, but you're now telling me that notification was not received, at least, by Defence, by Australia, until after it commenced. That's not any notification at all, is it?
No.
Okay. Well, that's contrary to the evidence that the Prime Minister and other senior ministers have given publicly. Minister, can you account for the discrepancy here?
I think the government has been very clear that the notification fell short of expectations. It is our practice, and officials can speak to this, to provide 24 to 48 hours of notice for live fire exercises, to allow other affected parties to manage safety issues and to conduct planning. That did not occur in this case. The formal requirements are less than that, but this does fall short of best practice, and it falls short of the practice that we expect of our own, of the ADF. Officials may wish to add to that.
So, Senator, our expectation is that while the international practice requires vessels on the high seas to advise of their activity and take measures to ensure the safety of a firing event would occur, our view of best practice is that they are forewarned. In the Australian Flight Information Region, we would provide 48 hours notice in order to minimise that disruption, and perhaps equal or more importantly is our practice is that you do not conduct firings near international air lanes or major shipping lanes,
yes,
and we retain our firing zones well clear of those areas, which significantly mitigates the risk to commercial or other traffic.
And I am keen to come back to that very important distinction you've drawn between our conduct and their conduct, because some people have compared our conduct to their conduct, and I'd be interested in exploring that with you subsequently. But just to be clear, had it not been the case that a Virgin commercial airliner had been in the area, picked up that radio report and referred it to Air Services Australia, how long would it have taken for us to know that this live firing exercise was taking place?
The advice through the New Zealand vessel on station, through its national and reporting, we received that at 11:01 of the morning. That is approximately 50 minutes or somewhat less than an hour since that advice came to us from Air Services.
But 90 minutes after the window commenced for the live firing exercise.
That we here knew, but of course the important notification is to vessels and aircraft operating in the proximity of the activity.
Well, that's one important, but it's also important that you know too, isn't it?
It's critical that platforms in the area know, because they are the ones that would be at risk if it was not well conducted.
So just to clarify, it's not really notification of an upcoming exercise if we only find out about it after it's commenced, is it?
But the notification, Senator, is to those platform aircraft ships that are operating in the area. So that's the requirement that has to be satisfied, and why we hold the view that that notification was inadequate.
But it's not really inadequate. It just wasn't given. We weren't provided any notification, because notification is something that happens prior to something starting, not afterwards.
I think, Senator, you may be misunderstanding the nature of the obligation.
Please assist me.
Well, the officials can talk you through it, but the obligation is around providing notification so that aircraft operating in that area may adjust their activities to maintain safety.
That's the bare minimum, Minister.
That is the bare minimum. That is the international law. The government has additionally been concerned that it does not meet best practice. And there are two benchmarks here. There is what is legal, and then there is best practice. We don't consider this meets best practice, and we've been very clear about that, that 24 hours notice, which we would expect in terms of notice to airmen, has not occurred, and it's on that basis that we have raised that with China.
Or, in fact, any notice. Sorry, were you going to add something to that, Admiral?
The Senator's characterisation is right, that, as I have said, the requirement is that firing vessels notify of their activity. That does not specify a pre-notification period, and that they take active steps to manage the safety of aircraft or vessels in the proximity of the firing.
So at the time of the incident, it was New Zealand which had responsibility for monitoring the ships, is that correct?
The New Zealand ship was in the proximity, yes.
Yeah. And At what point did we take responsibility for monitoring the exercise?
The New Zealand ship remained with that live firing, or with the Chinese task group, through both the Friday and the Saturday when the second event occurred. I don't propose to indicate when we have switched vessels in and out. That's part of our planning of how to respond in the circumstance that we have, but it was the New Zealand frigate that was there for both the Friday and the Saturday.
How did a Virgin commercial aircraft pick up this before our New Zealand friends did, if they were monitoring it?
But I don't know whether that is the case that they did. What I indicated was the reporting pathway is quite different. So an aircraft has immediate access through air traffic control to report an incident of that nature, who then directly communicate it to Air Services Australia. It's as air safety should be, it's a very direct and well-practiced pathway. Concurrently, the military reporting chain would have moved through the New Zealand reporting system and then into providing advice to Australia. So they both be heard at the same time, but the means of reporting them is always going to be more direct through an aircraft to an air traffic control service.
But the impression you've given me before is that we were sharing responsibility with our New Zealand partners for monitoring the movement of this task group, that it was kind of seamlessly interchanged between us, that we were talking and communicating all the time. How is it that it was an hour quicker to find out via a commercial plane that there was a live firing exercise than with one of our closest security partners, whom we are engaged in a joint mission of monitoring this activity?
Because, as I explained, Senator, the pathway for an aircraft is very direct and immediate. The pathway for an event which was an indication of a high seas firing occurring through the military command chain had more steps involved in it than the pathway for an aircraft reporting to an air traffic control service.
An hour and 3 minutes longer? I mean, shouldn't it be much quicker than that? Shouldn't it be as quick as a commercial pilot is able to do so?
But it's perhaps only 2 calls for a commercial pilot to do it. The military reporting system for an event of this nature will generally lag the pace of reporting that you could do with an immediate radio call from an aircraft.
I think that would be a great surprise to most ordinary Australians if they're watching this. They would think that it would be direct and immediate through military reporting channels, and that if we were monitoring a task group of another nation in our region with our closest partners, that notification would be much prompter than that. That we wouldn't be relying on commercial airliners to report incredibly important safety information.
The commercial airlines, on a matter that is of direct interest and impact to them, have a very immediate reporting pathway. The military reporting line would have recognised that this is a high seas firing event and was noteworthy of reporting, but the immediacy of it would have been different to the 2 platform types.
Why didn't one of our P8s pick this up and report it earlier?
Because it wasn't proximate to the firing at the time.
Right. Did New Zealand have air assets in the area?
Not at the time of the firing, no.
Right. Thank you, Chair. If an Australian frigate was in the area observing this, would the reporting have been more immediate?
It would have had less steps involved in it, so yes, I would have expected that it would have been more immediate.
How much?
That's a difficult question.
It's a professional judgment in your experience.
Well, it's a hypothetical.
I would have expected it to have come through our reporting. I think the only definitive answer I could give, Senator, it would have taken less time than when you have to go through another nation's reporting system as well.
Okay, I know the Chair's trying to chair the call.
Thanks very
Now,
much.
Senator Patterson, you've got the call.
Admiral Johnson, you said earlier that you're confident the ADF had the assets that it needed to do the surveillance that was necessary on this task group. You also acknowledged that the activities of this task group is unprecedented, and the Secretary said in his opening statement that it's a highly capable task group. But we've learnt this morning that because it was New Zealand that was monitoring the task group at the time of the live firing exercise, the notification to Australia was slower than it would have otherwise been if we were monitoring it. So was it a mistake not to have constant ADF surveillance of this task group?
Senator, I think it's important that we work with our partners in circumstances like the task group presented, that we remain uncertain to what the task group's direction might be. For a large period it was moving towards New Zealand, and very appropriate to have a New Zealand frigate that was available to be part of our monitoring assessment to it. So I think it's really important that we are able to work with other countries, that we're able to bring together the strengths that we have. In my evidence to you, I also indicated we needed to be ready for a variety of potential different paths that the task group may have taken, and together we were putting in place the capabilities to be able to manage whatever pathway they took.
But, and no one would suggest we shouldn't be working with our New Zealand colleagues or any other close partners, as you've acknowledged, notification through defence channels of this live firing exercise was slower than it would have otherwise been had it been us maintaining that constant surveillance. What was more important for ADF assets to be doing than monitoring this task group?
What was most important is the Chinese providing appropriate notification of their intentions.
We're in agreement on that. We're in complete agreement on that, but I think we've learnt over the last week, if it wasn't already evident, we can't rely on them to do that, and that would be a dangerous assumption to start from, given that we can't rely on them on that. Why shouldn't the ADF have been providing our own constant surveillance?
Because we were very confident in the insights that we had on the movement of that task group, and we had our vessels and aircraft available to the extent that we needed it to be able to move in different directions. It's a cooperative activity, Senator, that we were trying to achieve, and making sure that we remained as well positioned. Ships have set endurances. We need to make sure that we were husbanding or stewarding those capabilities well for that variety of different or pathways that we may have had to been dealing with.
Yes, but you also did say to me earlier that you were confident we had the assets that we needed to do the surveillance that was required, and you've acknowledged that notification through defence channels was significantly delayed. I mean, an hour and 3 minutes delayed from the first notification from a civilian airliner. Who knows, perhaps we would have picked it up at 9:30 had there been a P8 or an Australian frigate in the area.
I think you can't remove the responsibility of the task group for it. It's responsible for making sure the safety of civil or maritime activity in the area.
I will be the last to do that, Admiral Johnson, but I think you would agree that it's very clear, if it wasn't already, we can't rely on the PLA and to do that, can we?
I think in this circumstance, the conduct of their activities was clearly disruptive and unresponsible.
Okay. The financial review is very helpfully pieced together somewhat of a timeline from public reporting. I just want to see if we can flesh this out. So I'm going to run through it, and if you could correct anything that's wrong and add anything that you can as we go through. So the task group first commenced its firing exercise or window at 9:30. The Virgin pilot alerted Air Services Australia at 9:58. Air Services Australia warned planes flying across the Tasman to avoid the area at 10 a.m. Air Services Australia contacted JOC at 10:10. Is that correct?
Yes.
Do you actually have a timeline there, and could you table it if you do?
I have parts of the timeline from the knowledge that we have, clearly not that from the civil aircraft or some of the other participants, but I have an indication of those key timings of, as we understand it, Senator, that I have, yes.
Can you table it?
I think I could provide it on notice to give it to you. I've got to be able to provide you with that summary.
Maybe just read it into the record then.
Yeah, or alternatively, you could read it on the record rather than me reading a timeline. You've got probably a more authoritative version. Why don't you commence from there?
So the timings that I have are at 9, and if I will use Australian Daylight Saving Time, if I might, throughout 9:58, the Air Services was made aware by a Virgin pilot 10:10, Defence was notified by Air Services of the broadcast and the firing window that was part of the task group's security call. 11:01, Defence received advice from the New Zealand Defence Force that had been on-forwarded from the frigate that was operating in the area.
Okay, so Jock was notified at 10:10 by Air Services Australia. When were you first notified as CDF?
Of the Jock or the reporting?
Yeah.
I have to get that time. I don't have that in my chronology.
Do you have a memory of roughly when it was?
It was around midday.
Around midday.
Yes.
Okay. Secretary,
Slightly before.
Secretary, when were you first notified?
I would have been notified around the same time as the CDF, Senator.
When was the Deputy Prime Minister first notified?
We had provided advice to the Deputy Prime Minister's office, initial advice at 11:30 in the morning.
So, Defence notified the DPM's office before you were notified?
It would have been around the same time, so I'd said around midday.
Sure.
I would have
I won't hold you
about
to
the
that
same
exactly.
time.
If you can come back on notice with the precise time, that would be helpful. When was the Prime Minister first notified, or his office?
11:30 a.m.
Okay.
Sorry, that was the Deputy Prime Minister.
Yes, and I'm asking when was the Prime Minister notified?
I'm unable to provide that advice
Why not?
because I didn't communicate directly with the Prime Minister. Advice would have been
He's
through
publicly
means that
said
we
that
may not have an
He has
awareness of.
publicly said that you briefed him.
I did have a discussion with the Prime
When was
Minister,
that?
but that was in the afternoon.
Okay, what time was that?
It was around 4 p.m.
Okay. Did you brief any other ministers?
No.
Have you briefed NSC?
Well, we don't go to the content of NSC briefings, Senator.
Well, I wasn't asking for the content, just the
You
timing.
are.
So, but I think I heard the Admiral say he didn't brief NSC, so presumably NSC hasn't been convened on this matter, Minister.
Senator, we don't confirm the content of those meetings, nor do we confirm the timing of them.
Minister, that's a new convention because the Prime Minister has repeatedly publicly disclosed meetings of the National Security Cabinet, not just the timing but the content. For example, after the Adas Israel bombing, he disclosed that the NSC had met and that it was briefed by the AFP Commissioner and ASIO. He's done that on many occasions. So why does this convention apply now in this instance but not in those?
I'll take your question on notice, Senator.
Thank you. So just going back to the timeline, when was the Infrastructure Minister first notified?
Oh, Senator, I think those are questions for the infrastructure portfolio.
11:42.
Yes, I think that is right.
It is. So Catherine King knew and was briefed at 11:42 a.m. according to the evidence on Monday evening by Air Services Australia.
Well,
Although actually
Senator,
the AFR says that Catherine King was briefed at 11:20. Do you know?
Senator, it's not for officials in Defence or the ADF to provide advice about interactions between the Minister for Infrastructure and her portfolio.
It is if it's in their state of knowledge. I'm asking what they know.
Senator, I do not know what time other ministers were briefed, no.
And you have said you have not briefed any other ministers. Haven't briefed the Foreign Minister?
I have briefed the Deputy Prime Minister and the Prime Minister.
But the Foreign Minister was tasked to raise this on Australia's behalf with the Chinese Foreign Minister. Wouldn't a briefing from Defence be necessary to assist that?
We would have made sure the Department of Foreign Affairs had the material necessary to brief the Foreign Minister.
Okay, so they took charge of the briefing, to your knowledge.
But
You
they
can
would have
direct those
supported the Foreign
questions to
Minister.
Minister Wong tomorrow.
I look forward to that opportunity. Admiral Johnson, you alluded before to the differences in the way Australia would conduct an activity like this compared to the way that the PLAN has conducted it. One of the differences that you pointed out is that we would have given greater notice, 24 to 48 hours. Is there any other differences in the way that we conduct ourselves?
The differences would be observed by what occurred. So, Senator, if I understand, so we do not conduct high seas firings near civil air lanes, nor do we conduct them near civil maritime routes. So we make sure our firings are are kept clear of those areas to avoid disruption to either military or commercial traffic that might be occurring. We also pre-warn, so we have a rule that applies inside our flight information region where we provide 48 hours notice for it through notices to mariners. If we are outside our flight information region, at least 4 hours before the commencement of a firing window, we will be providing warnings. But that goes hand in hand with our approach of operating outside of those areas that is likely to pose risks to aircraft or vessels.
So we've never conducted a live firing exercise in the South China Sea, for example, underneath a flight path of civilian airliners.
We've conducted firings in the South China Sea with partners in exercise areas. We do that with our firepower defence arrangement. We do it with other regional partners, but we do it as part of a constructed exercise that has the appropriate arrangements placed around it.
Were any of them underneath the flight path of civilian airliners?
Senator, I can't be equivocal about that over the many firings we've operated, as you know, for decades.
Yeah, in your state of knowledge.
But we would have applied our safety practices for every single one of them and to have complied in a way that we believe is best practice for those firings. So I'm not aware of any firing occurring that has caused commentary to come back about the nature of that firing for an Australian vessel.
Let me ask it this way. I think it was disclosed again to Senator Mackenzie by Air Services Australia on Monday night that 49 commercial aircraft had to divert their route because of these live firing exercises. To your knowledge, have commercial airliners ever had to divert their route because of a firing exercise that Australia's conducted in the South China Sea, for example?
That may have been the case, but it would have been pre-warned, so that would have been a diversion that was managed with the appropriate time to do so. I'm not aware of an occasion where civil air traffic have had to, at very short notice, divert as a consequence of our firing.
Are there any strategic differences between the South China Sea and the Tasman Sea?
Sorry, Senator.
Are there any differences in the strategic environment in the South China Sea compared to the Tasman Sea?
In what context do you mean,
for example, are there any disputed islands or features in the Tasman Sea?
Not that I'm aware of, but clearly different environments between the two, but no disputed features that I'm aware of.
Any disputed international claims to territory in the Tasman Sea?
Not that I'm aware of.
No. Is the Tasman Sea a significant international shipping route to many countries?
It can be, depending on the ocean passageways that either move south of our country or north of our country, not all of which involve direct trade into or from Australia. Compared
to the volume of shipping activity in the South China Sea, how does the Tasman Sea rank?
It's less busy.
How much less busy? A little bit less busy, or...?
It's significantly less busy.
Yes, I would think so. So why does Australia conduct operations in the South China Sea?
So we conduct them in order to work with our partners in the region. We build capacity and confidence in the way we work together. A part of our activities are equally to uphold international law in those areas and to demonstrate the best practice in doing so.
And because it's a significant international waterway with significant trade routes which are related to our interest as a maritime trading nation, and, as you say, to assert our perspective on international law in the area, and because it's strategically significant, do any of those factors apply to the Tasman Sea?
I think they're strategically significant to us as key sea lines of communication, but there are differences between the two regions, but the general principles equally apply in both.
Yes. Is the Tasman Sea strategically significant for China?
You need to ask the Chinese that, Senator.
How could the Tasman Sea? How could the Tasman Sea be strategically significant to China? For what reason would it be strategically significant to China?
Senator, if I could add,
please.
I think the Chinese are signalling, they are practising and rehearsing, and they are collecting.
And why would they have an interest in doing that in this remote part of the world where there are no disputes in relation to international law, where there are no disputed features, where it is not a significant trading route for them or for anyone else other than us? What's the purpose of doing it so far south in the Tasman Sea?
I think China's made clear that it is growing a blue water naval capability. It's claiming certainly regional and global interests as a maritime power, and I expect that they will wish to continue to be present in an increasing number of international waterways in the years ahead.
So, Admiral, do you think it's fair or reasonable to compare the way Australia conducts ourselves in the South China Sea and the way that the PLAN has conducted themselves in the Tasman Sea?
Are you specifically referring to the high seas firing?
Yes.
I think what we have seen is, I think I've characterised that it is clearly disruptive to civil air traffic, as we've seen. It doesn't demonstrate the best practice that we would expect from mariners operating in that region. So it sure falls short of the standard that we apply to ourselves, and in that sense it was irresponsible.
Yes, so you wouldn't characterise our behaviour in the South China Sea as irresponsible or unprofessional or disruptive or reckless or any of those things?
No, I think we operate in a manner that is entirely consistent with international law and the high standards of a professional military force, which is what the ADF is.
So it's not a fair comparison between the recent activities of the PLAN in relation to these live firing exercises and Australia's conduct in the South China Sea or elsewhere?
No.
No. Well, the Prime Minister has repeatedly publicly compared them. He's drawn an equivalence between them. He says, and I quote, "Australia conducts exercises in the South China Sea and in the region, in international waters and international airspace." And he even went on to say that the location of the South China Sea is hinted at in its name. Why do you think the Prime Minister has made this comparison if it's not a fair one?
Senator, the government has been incredibly clear that we will continue to exercise our rights to operate in international waters, and you see that reflected in statements from the Prime Minister down. The Prime Minister has also made the straightforward observation, as have other ministers, that we respect the right of others to exercise freedom of navigation and oversight in international waters and airspace. At the same time, we are disappointed in the particular notification around this live fire exercise. We've made it really clear that the benchmark that we would apply is a best practice benchmark, giving advance notice, giving the best possible opportunity for people to make accommodations, to manage safety. We're clear that we do not think this meets the standards of best practice, and we've raised that with China, as has been made publicly known.
Minister, aren't we entitled to expect better from our comprehensive strategic partner?
I think we've been very clear about the approach here. We do think that this could have been handled better, and we've raised those concerns with China directly, including through the Foreign Minister.
The government's pursuing a foreign policy of stabilising relations with China. Is this evidence of stabilisation?
From the very beginning of our government's tenure, we've been clear that this is an important and challenging relationship. Our approach to it is to be steady, to be consistent, to raise our concerns and our interests in a very predictable and consistent way, and that's what you are seeing here. Whether it's in relation to the unprofessional and unsafe interaction, which we haven't discussed in any detail this morning, or whether it's in relation to the live fire exercise, we use every opportunity to raise these issues directly with counterparts at the appropriate level.
Okay, I just want to go back to this timeliness of notifications. We've got the transcript from Senate estimates on Monday from Services Australia, and they did confirm that the department informed the Minister for Infrastructure's office at 11:20. So it seems that the Minister for Infrastructure was briefed before the Deputy Prime Minister and Defence Minister and before you were briefed. But doesn't this indicate a pretty fundamental breakdown in our reporting system?
Senator, this was principally an air safety matter. So having that rapid communication flow, as we've described, from the aircraft through to air services and the Minister, is a reflection of it was an air safety matter. And so think that pathway is the important pathway while the defence reporting was being run concurrent with it. But you're describing a matter of minutes, not a more significant differentiation in time between the two.
I think most Australians would expect if a foreign military is conducting activities in our region that the first person to know about it would be the Defence Minister and Deputy Prime Minister, not the Infrastructure Minister. I mean, if God forbid, conflict were to break out in our region, should we call Catherine King to ask what's going on first before we call Richard Marles?
But Senator, you're referring to events that were conducted on the high seas, consistent with international law, less than best practice as we have described, but to draw an equivalence to a different set of circumstances where our national security is at risk is not a reasonable equivalence of the two events.
It's not a national security issue if there's a live firing exercise by the PLAN in our region?
That we're not notified about?
I said that our national security is at risk.
It's not a risk to our national security that Australian civilians in aircraft flying to New Zealand have to divert with no notice because a live firing exercise being conducted by a foreign military?
I think that it is a significant event and clearly was disruptive to civil air services, but I'm not aware of any characterisation that indicated those aircraft were at immediate risk.
Okay, so just to confirm for the record, there was no prior notification from the PLAN or the Chinese government prior to this live firing exercise on Friday?
That's correct.
Nor on Saturday?
Correct.
In the second live firing incident. It was also the New Zealand military that was monitoring the second live firing incident?
That's right.
And how was the timeliness of that notification?
Last minute.
Jonathan, you got to go.
11:50. Senator Rear Admiral Jonathan Earley, Head of Military Strategic Commitments. We received advice at approximately 11:50 Australian Eastern Daylight Saving Time, advice from the New Zealand Defence Force, that they'd overheard a broadcast on open air channels of the PLA task group to conduct a high seas firing over the period of 1200 to 1500 Australian Eastern Daylight Saving Time.
So just to be clear, when did the live firing exercise take place?
That was the window. We did receive advice. That particular firing, the New Zealand Defence Force did observe.
Yes.
And
so the firing was at 11:50?
That's when we received the report.
Yep.
So that was 11:50 for the window that they broadcast between 12 and 1500.
Yep. And the actual live firing occurred at?
At 13:08 or 1:08.
Yep.
Okay. And there, again, were no Australian assets in the area?
It was being monitored by the New Zealand frigate.
Okay. So when were you notified, CDF?
Senator, I don't have that specific timeline available to me.
Okay. When was the Deputy Prime Minister notified?
The Deputy Prime Minister was notified, or the Office of the Deputy Prime Minister was notified at 1300.
At 1300, so prior to the live firing exercise itself, but an hour and a half roughly after the report came in. Is my maths right there?
Or an hour and
10 minutes.
Okay, thank you. When was the Prime Minister notified about this second live firing exercise?
I can't answer that question, Senator. I'm not privy to that.
Admiral, did you brief the Prime Minister in relation to the second live firing incident?
No, I did not.
Do we know if anyone did?
I know the Prime Minister has been regularly updated, but I don't have that.
By whom?
The Prime Minister is briefed by a range of different personnel, and I believe this was canvassed. These issues were canvassed on Monday, PM&C estimates.
Okay, well then, do you know the answer, Minister?
I'll take that on notice, Senator, but these questions are best directed to the Prime Minister's department and his representative in estimates, and that occurred on Monday.
Well, all right, we'll need to move the call along.